Most people believe murder cases are solved in courtrooms. They're not. In America, most murder cases are won or lost long before a jury is ever selected, often before the public even knows a crime has occurred. The truth is, the first 48 hours after a murder quietly decide everything. During this narrow window, investigators are racing against a force they cannot slow down. Evidence begins to disappear. Witness memories start to change. Small decisions turn into permanent consequences. What police secure in these first hours becomes the foundation of the entire case. What they miss can never be recovered, no matter how advanced technology becomes later. This is the phase where cases are strengthened or quietly damaged beyond repair. In this documentary, we break down what really happens in the first 48 hours after a murder in America. Why investigators say this period determines the outcome. How cases collapse before they ever reach court. And why this short window is where most murder cases are truly won or lost. Before we begin, tap like, leave a comment, and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us uncover the darkest corners of the prison system. Now let's step inside. Every murder investigation in the United States begins the same way, with a phone call. Sometimes it's a frantic 911 call from someone who just discovered a body. Sometimes it's a neighbor reporting a noise they can't explain. Sometimes it's a family member who knows something is wrong before the words are even spoken. But regardless of how calm or chaotic that call sounds, the moment it is logged into the system, the clock starts running. From that second forward, every decision made and every decision delayed begins shaping the outcome of the case. The first response. The first officers to arrive at a suspected murder scene are not detectives. They're patrol officers. Their job is not to solve the crime. Their job is to stabilize a situation that may still be dangerous. They arrive with limited information. They don't know who the victim is. They don't know who might still be nearby. They don't know if the threat is over or still unfolding. In these first minutes, the priority is survival. Officers scan for immediate danger. They check for signs of life. They call for medical support, even when the outcome already seems clear. These actions are not just procedural. They are legally and ethically required. But they also introduce the first unavoidable risk to the investigation, because every person who enters the scene changes it. Chaos before control. In the first hour, a murder scene is rarely quiet. Paramedics arrive. Supervisors respond. Additional officers secure the area. Neighbors gather. Family members cry, shout, or collapse. Even when everyone involved is trained, disciplined, and well-intentioned, the scene is under constant threat. Doors are opened. Lights are turned on. Objects are moved without realizing their significance. Footprints are tracked across floors. Fibers are transferred between clothing. Smells dissipate. Temperatures change. And all of this happens before a single detective has officially taken control. This is why investigators later say that the first hour after a murder is the most fragile moment in the entire case. Because once the scene is altered, it can never be restored. Defining the crime scene. One of the most misunderstood aspects of murder investigations is the definition of a crime scene. It is not just the room where the body is found. It includes entry points, exit routes, areas the victim traveled through, objects the suspect may have touched, spaces witnesses may have occupied. In the first hour, officers must make rapid decisions about where the scene begins and where it ends. If the perimeter is drawn too small, critical evidence may be left outside. If it is drawn too large, control becomes impossible. These decisions are often made with incomplete information, under pressure, and in emotionally charged environments. And they matter more than the public realizes. Years later, when cases collapse in court, it is often because defense attorneys point to this moment, when the scene was defined incorrectly and evidence integrity was compromised. The first observations. While patrol officers are not tasked with solving the crime, their observations are crucial. They note the position of the body, the condition of the surroundings, the emotional state of anyone present. Statements made spontaneously. These early observations are often the most honest version of events, because people have not yet had time to shape narratives. Stories have not yet been rehearsed. Shock has not yet turned into strategy. A single offhand comment made in these first minutes can later become a critical lead or a devastating contradiction. That is why officers document everything, even details that seem insignificant at the time. Because murder investigations are not built on dramatic revelations. They are built on small details that survive scrutiny. When time starts working against the case, from the outside, it may appear that nothing much happens in the first hour. But internally, investigators know something critical is happening. Time is already erasing evidence. Blood begins to dry. Electronic devices lose power. Environmental conditions alter surfaces. Witnesses begin speaking to each other. And every second that passes increases the difficulty of separating fact from contamination. This is why investigators say that the first hour is not about answers. It is about preservation. Preserving the scene. Preserving information. Preserving options. Once those options are lost, they cannot be recreated, no matter how much technology improves later. The emotional factor. Another element that defines the first hour is emotion. Murder scenes are rarely sterile. They are personal. Family members may be present. Friends may arrive unexpectedly. Witnesses may be in shock or denial. Officers must balance compassion with control. Allowing too much access risks evidence contamination. Restricting access too harshly can escalate tension and create conflict. Every interaction is being watched, not just by those present, but eventually by juries, attorneys, and the public. This is why experienced officers slow everything down. They know that once emotions take over, mistakes multiply. The arrival of detectives. By the end of the first hour, detectives are notified. When they arrive, they are not stepping into a clean slate. They are inheriting a scene that has already been influenced by emergency response, human movement, emotional reactions, environmental exposure. From this point forward, their job is to work with what remains, not what once existed. And the quality of that foundation depends entirely on what happened in the first 60 minutes. If the scene was controlled properly, the case begins with strength. If it was not, the investigation starts at a disadvantage that may never be overcome. Why this hour matters so much. The public often imagines that murder cases fall apart because of lack of effort. In reality, many fail because of early fragility. The first hour sets the tone for everything that follows. It determines how much evidence survives, how credible the timeline becomes, how defensible the investigation will be in court. Mistakes made here are not dramatic. They are procedural, and they are permanent. Because in murder investigations, the damage is rarely visible right away. It appears months later, in suppressed evidence, conflicting testimony, and unanswered questions that no one can fix. And all of it traces back to that first call, the moment the clock started. By the time the first hour ends, the most visible chaos has usually passed. Sirens fade into the distance. Crowds thin out. The initial shock settles into a tense stillness. But this is not the moment when a murder investigation slows down. This is the moment when it becomes dangerously fragile. Because between the first and sixth hour after a murder, investigators are not racing to solve the case. They are racing to preserve its future. Everything that happens during this window determines whether the case will ever be strong enough to survive scrutiny, cross-examination, and time itself. And most people never see this part. The transition from emergency to investigation. Once the scene is declared safe and medical personnel have done what they can, control officially shifts. Patrol officers step back. Detectives take command. Crime scene technicians begin their work. This transition is not symbolic. It is structural. From this moment forward, every movement inside the perimeter must be deliberate, documented, and defensible. Because what investigators are really doing now is not just collecting evidence. They are building a record that will one day be challenged by attorneys who are not present, but who will question every decision as if they were. This is why experienced investigators slow the pace instead of accelerating it. Speed feels productive, but speed destroys cases. Why the crime scene is already under attack. The public often imagines a crime scene as frozen in time. In reality, it is decaying second by second. Air circulation alters trace particles. Temperature changes affect biological material. Sunlight degrades surfaces. Humidity changes chemical stability. And human presence, even trained professionals, is the greatest threat of all. Every step transfers fibers. Every surface touched alters potential fingerprints. Every object moved introduces doubt. This is why securing the scene is not about tape and barricades. It is about discipline. Who enters, why they enter, what they touch, how long they stay. Every entry and exit is logged, not for bureaucracy, but for survival in court. Because if even one unauthorized person enters the scene, the defense will later ask a simple question. How do you know the evidence wasn't contaminated? And if investigators cannot answer that question with certainty, the case weakens immediately. The perimeter problem. One of the most critical decisions in this phase is defining the perimeter. Make it too small, and critical evidence lies outside, unprotected and unrecovered. Make it too large, and control collapses. This decision is often made with incomplete information. Investigators may not yet know where the suspect entered, where the suspect exited, whether the crime began elsewhere, whether the body was moved. That uncertainty forces investigators to think beyond the obvious, because the most important evidence in a murder case is often not found next to the body. It is found in hallways, on sidewalks, in vehicles, at entry points, along escape routes. Cases have failed because investigators assumed the scene was smaller than it actually was. And once that mistake is made, it cannot be corrected. Documentation before collection. In the first 6 hours, nothing is collected immediately. Everything is documented first. Photographs are taken from wide angles to close-ups. Video captures spatial relationships. Notes record lighting conditions, weather, and environmental factors. This documentation serves one purpose: to preserve the scene as it existed, because within hours, it will be gone forever. Defense attorneys do not challenge evidence alone. They challenge context. They ask, where exactly was this found? What was nearby? What changed before it was collected? Without documentation, evidence becomes isolated, and isolation creates doubt. The silent pressure begins. By hour 2 or 3, the pressure starts to build. Supervisors want updates. Departments want direction. Media begins monitoring radio traffic. Community speculation grows. But this is the worst possible time to rush. Because murder investigations fail most often not due to lack of effort, but due to early overconfidence. Investigators are trained to resist conclusions during this phase. Instead, they ask control questions. Does the scene match the initial report? Are there inconsistencies? Does the environment support the timeline? If something feels wrong, it is noted, not ignored. Because instincts don't solve cases. Evidence does. Scene narrowing, the invisible killer of cases. One of the most dangerous mistakes in the first 6 hours is scene narrowing. This happens when investigators unconsciously focus on a single explanation too early. A domestic dispute, a known associate, a familiar pattern. Once this happens, attention shifts. Searches become selective. Evidence is evaluated through assumption. Alternate possibilities fade into the background. This is not corruption. It is human psychology under pressure, and it has destroyed countless cases. Because when investigators stop asking what else could this be, they stop seeing what doesn't fit. And what doesn't fit is often the truth. Why these hours matter more than technology. The public believes technology saves cases. DNA, databases, advanced forensics. But technology cannot recover evidence that was never preserved. If a footprint was washed away by rain before it was documented, no database can bring it back. If surveillance footage was overwritten before it was requested, it is gone forever. If a surface was touched without gloves, the fingerprint is compromised. Technology works only if time allows it to. And time is being lost right now. The scene will never be this honest again. By the end of the first 6 hours, the scene has told investigators everything it ever will. After that, evidence is processed elsewhere. The environment changes. Human activity resumes. From this point forward, the investigation depends not on the scene, but on what investigators managed to protect before it disappeared. This is why experienced detectives say, "You don't solve a murder at the scene. You decide whether it can ever be solved." The quiet consequence. When murder cases collapse years later, the failure rarely looks dramatic. It looks procedural, a suppressed piece of evidence, a questionable chain of custody, a missing photograph, an undocumented entry. And every one of those failures traces back to this window between the 1st and 6th hour, when a case was still alive, when time could still be slowed, when decisions still mattered. Because once this phase ends, the investigation moves forward carrying whatever weaknesses were allowed to form. And those weaknesses never disappear. They only wait. By the time a murder investigation reaches its 6th hour, something fundamental changes. The crime scene has begun to fall silent. The tape remains, but the urgency shifts. The physical evidence has largely been identified. From this point forward, the investigation turns to its most unstable element: people. And unlike blood, fingerprints, or objects, people do not preserve evidence. They alter it. The myth of reliable memory. The public often believes that witnesses are walking recordings, that if someone saw or heard something important, they will remember it clearly when asked. Investigators know this is not true. Memory begins changing almost immediately after a traumatic event. Stress narrows perception. Shock distorts time. Fear fills in gaps with assumptions. Within hours, what a witness believes they saw may already differ from what actually happened. And once memory changes, it does not revert. It evolves. This is why the period between hour 6 and hour 24 is one of the most dangerous phases of a murder investigation. Because this is when investigators must rely on information that feels solid, but often isn't. The race to find witnesses. Contrary to popular belief, witnesses do not come forward automatically. Many don't realize they witnessed anything important. Others assume someone else has already spoken to police. Some actively avoid involvement. During this phase, investigators begin canvassing. They knock on doors. They review nearby locations. They reconstruct who might have been present, even briefly. Every delay matters. A witness interviewed 6 hours after an event is not the same witness interviewed 24 hours later. Details blur. Confidence increases where certainty should not. Stories become cleaner and less accurate. Because the human brain hates uncertainty. The contamination problem. One of the most damaging forces during this phase is cross-contamination of memory. Witnesses talk. They talk to family. They talk to neighbors. They talk to co-workers. They watch the news. Each conversation subtly reshapes memory. Details are reinforced or erased not based on truth, but on repetition. This is why experienced investigators try to isolate witnesses early, not to intimidate them, but to preserve what remains of their original recollection. Once witnesses begin sharing versions of events, those versions begin to merge. And when that happens, separating truth from influence becomes nearly impossible. Early statements versus later testimony. The first statement a witness gives is often the most valuable, even if it is incomplete or unclear. Later statements may sound more confident, more detailed, more coherent. But confidence does not equal accuracy. In court, juries often believe confident witnesses. Defense attorneys know this. They compare early statements to later testimony, searching for changes, not to uncover truth, but to create doubt. A single inconsistency can weaken an entire case. And many of those inconsistencies are created right here, when memory begins shifting under pressure. The problem of helpful witnesses. Not all unreliable witnesses are dishonest. Some genuinely want to help. They offer interpretations instead of observations. They fill gaps with logic instead of memory. They tell investigators what makes sense rather than what they actually saw. This is dangerous, because once an interpretation enters the investigation, it can be mistaken for fact. Investigators must constantly filter what was observed from what was assumed. And under time pressure, that line becomes thin. Emotional stakes rise. By now, families are demanding answers. Communities are speculating. Media interest grows. Witnesses feel pressure, not just from police, but from everyone around them. Some exaggerate to feel important. Some withdraw out of fear. Some change their stories to avoid attention. None of this requires malice. It requires stress. And stress is everywhere during the first 24 hours. When stories conflict, as statements accumulate, contradictions appear. Two people describe the same moment differently. Timelines don't align. Descriptions clash. Investigators must decide which accounts carry weight. This is not always based on credibility. Sometimes it's based on consistency. Sometimes proximity. Sometimes instinct. And once a version is chosen as most accurate, others quietly lose influence. This is how blind spots form, not because investigators ignore evidence, but because they prioritize coherence. The first narrative forms. By the end of the first day, something subtle but critical happens. A narrative begins to take shape. Not publicly, internally. Investigators begin describing the case in shorthand. They summarize events. They explain it to supervisors. That explanation becomes a lens. From this point forward, new information is often evaluated against the emerging narrative, not independently. This is not corruption. It is human cognition, but it is also how investigations narrow prematurely. The danger of early conclusions. Once investigators believe they understand what happened, they begin looking for confirmation. They revisit statements that fit. They question inconsistencies more aggressively. They apply pressure where they believe it belongs. This can extract information, but it can also distort it. Witnesses sense expectations. They adjust unknowingly. They align their stories with perceived conclusions. And with each alignment, the investigation becomes less flexible. When silence becomes a problem, not all witnesses speak. Some leave town. Some stop answering calls. Some decide the risk isn't worth it. The longer investigators wait, the fewer voices remain. And silence creates gaps. Gaps invite assumptions. Assumptions harden into belief. Why cases break years later? When murder cases fall apart years down the line, the failure often traces back to witness handling. Not because witnesses lied, but because memory was allowed to drift unchecked. Defense attorneys exploit this. They replay early interviews. They highlight changes. They ask juries a simple question. If the memory changed once, how do we know it didn't change again? And once that doubt exists, evidence must carry the entire case alone. If it cannot, the case collapses. The quiet end of the first day. By hour 24, the investigation feels active. Statements are collected. Leads are identified. Names circulate. But beneath that activity, something fragile has already begun to break. The window for pure, uncontaminated memory is closing. From this point forward, every witness statement is a reconstruction, not a snapshot. And that reality will follow the case forever. Because in murder investigations, memory does not fade slowly. It fractures early. And once fractured, by the time a murder investigation crosses the 24-hour mark, the tone changes. The frantic uncertainty of the first day begins to harden into something else. Expectation. The public expects progress. Supervisors expect direction. Families expect answers. And investigators, whether they admit it or not, begin to feel the weight of time pressing inward. This is the phase where murder cases often appear to accelerate. But in reality, they become more fragile than ever. Because between hour 24 and hour 36, the investigation enters the most psychologically dangerous territory of all. Interrogations, early suspect focus, and irreversible decisions. When the investigation turns inward. During the first day, investigators are outward focused. They secure scenes. They collect evidence. They gather information. But by the second day, the investigation turns inward. Now, it is about interpretation. Evidence is no longer just being collected. It is being weighed. Statements are no longer just recorded, they are evaluated. Leads are no longer equal, they are ranked. And with that ranking comes a shift in mindset. The question subtly changes from what happened to who did this. That shift feels natural. It also introduces risk, the birth of a suspect. Contrary to popular belief, suspects are not always identified through dramatic breakthroughs. Most often, they emerge through proximity. A spouse, a partner, a friend, a coworker, someone who is simply nearby. Statistically, this makes sense. But investigations are not statistics. They are individual events. And once a person is mentally classified as a suspect, everything about them is viewed differently. Their words, their behavior, their emotions, even silence becomes suspicious. This is not bias by intention. It is bias by pressure. Interrogations are not about truth. They are about control. Interrogations during this phase are often misunderstood. They are not conversations. They are not interviews. They are controlled environments designed to test consistency, credibility, and reaction under stress. Investigators look for changes in timelines, emotional responses, contradictions, over-explanations, avoidance. But human behavior under stress is unpredictable. An innocent person may appear deceptive. A guilty person may appear calm. Fear, confusion, exhaustion, and grief all mimic guilt. And during the second day of an investigation, fatigue becomes a factor for everyone involved. The time trap. By hour 24, investigators are already behind time. Evidence deadlines loom. Witnesses are harder to reach. Digital data requires legal authorization. Interrogations feel productive because they produce immediate output, statements, reactions, recordings. But this productivity can be deceptive because interrogations do not create evidence. They create interpretations of behavior. And interpretations are dangerous when time pressure is high. Confirmation bias enters quietly. Confirmation bias does not arrive loudly. It arrives subtly. An investigator hears a detail that fits the emerging narrative and remembers it. A detail that doesn't fit is set aside for later. Over time, later never comes. This does not require malice. It does not require incompetence. It requires urgency. Once a suspect theory forms, the investigation naturally reorganizes around it. Resources shift. Attention narrows. Alternate leads lose momentum. This is one of the most common failure points in murder investigations, and it almost always begins during this window. Miranda, rights, and the legal minefield. By this phase, legal boundaries become critical. Custodial status must be clear. Rights must be properly advised. Questioning must be documented precisely. Mistakes here do not weaken cases. They destroy them. A confession obtained improperly may never be heard by a jury. A statement taken without clarity can be suppressed entirely. And suppression does not require proof of coercion. It requires procedural error. Courts do not care how important the information was. They care how it was obtained. The pressure to have something. By the second day, internal pressure escalates. Supervisors want to know if progress is being made. Prosecutors want to know if charges are viable. Departments want reassurance. This creates a dangerous incentive, the appearance of progress. An identified suspect looks like progress. An interrogation looks like action. A working theory feels like control. But progress and certainty are not the same thing. And confusing the two has destroyed countless cases. False confidence is more dangerous than uncertainty. The most dangerous moment in this phase is not confusion. It is confidence. Once investigators believe they understand the case, the investigation stops asking uncomfortable questions. Why doesn't this detail fit? What if our assumption is wrong? What haven't we tested? Those questions feel inefficient under pressure, but they are essential because certainty reached too early becomes impossible to undo later. When alternate paths quietly close, as focus narrows, alternate suspects fade, not formally dismissed, just deprioritized. Their alibis are checked less aggressively. Their movements are no longer scrutinized. Their relevance quietly declines. This is not intentional tunnel vision. It is momentum, and momentum is powerful. By hour 36, reversing course becomes emotionally and institutionally difficult, because reversing course means admitting uncertainty, and uncertainty feels like failure. The long shadow of early decisions. The decisions made during this phase do not disappear. They follow the case into charging decisions, trial strategy, appeals, post-conviction review. When cases fail years later, investigators often say the same thing. At the time, it made sense, and it probably did. But sense under pressure is not the same as truth. Why this phase breaks so many cases. Interrogations feel decisive. Suspect identification feels necessary. Early narratives feel stabilizing. But all three can be destructive when time has not yet revealed the full picture. The investigation needs flexibility. This phase removes it, because by the end of hour 36, the case begins to harden. Beliefs form, assumptions settle, momentum locks in, and from this point forward, the investigation will spend more energy defending early decisions than questioning them. The illusion of control. By the end of this window, the investigation often feels organized. There's a suspect, there's a timeline, there's a working theory, but organization is not resolution, and control is not truth. What looks like clarity may simply be the absence of remaining options. Because the longer time passes, the fewer paths remain open. And once those paths close, they never reopen, standing on the edge of irreversibility. Hour 36 is not dramatic. There is no announcement, no turning point, just a quiet shift from exploration to defense, from curiosity to certainty, from investigation to justification. And this is where many murder cases quietly cross the line they can never return from. Because from this point forward, the case will move, but it will move in one direction only. By the time a murder investigation reaches its 36th hour, something irreversible has already begun. Not because the case is solved, not because the truth is clear, but because time has stopped working in the investigator's favor. From this point forward, the investigation is no longer about discovery. It is about living with what remains. When a case stops growing, during the first day, a murder investigation expands. New information arrives. New witnesses emerge. New possibilities remain open. By the second day, that expansion slows. And by hour 36, it nearly stops. This is not due to lack of effort. It is due to physics, biology, technology, and human limits. Evidence does not wait for certainty. Biological material continues to degrade. Trace evidence loses context. Environmental exposure alters surfaces beyond recognition. What investigators did not secure early cannot be recovered later. Not by advanced labs, not by future technology, not by renewed effort. This is the evidence clock, and it does not pause. The vanishing digital trail. The public often believes digital evidence lasts forever. Investigators know better. Surveillance systems overwrite footage automatically, sometimes within 24 hours, sometimes within days. Cell phone data is governed by retention limits and legal thresholds. Location data degrades, fragments, or becomes inaccessible without immediate action. By hour 36, many digital opportunities are already gone. What remains now requires warrants, subpoenas, approvals, and cooperation, all of which take time the case no longer has. This delay is not procedural laziness. It is the legal reality of investigations. And every delay narrows what can still be known. When evidence becomes interpretation. At this stage, investigators spend less time collecting evidence and more time interpreting what they already have. They analyze timelines. They compare statements. They test whether the evidence aligns with the working theory. This is necessary, but is also dangerous, because interpretation depends on perspective. And perspective, by now, is no longer neutral. The case hardens. By hour 36, the investigation has momentum. There's usually a primary suspect, a working timeline, a narrative that explains most details. This feels like progress. But it is also the moment when flexibility begins to disappear. Alternative explanations feel less likely, not because they were disproven, but because they no longer fit easily. Investigators do not stop looking for truth, but they begin looking for confirmation. This shift is subtle, and once it happens, reversing course becomes difficult. Prosecutorial gravity. By this stage, prosecutors are often involved, not to try the case, but to assess it. They ask, is there probable cause? Is the evidence admissible? Can this survive cross-examination? Their role is not to find truth. It is to determine whether the case is viable. This introduces a new gravity, because once prosecutors begin evaluating a case, the investigation starts orienting toward what can be proven, not what might still be unknown. This is necessary for justice, but it also locks the investigation into its current shape. The emotional deadline. While evidence degrades quietly, emotional pressure grows loudly. Families want certainty. Communities want reassurance. Leadership wants closure. Investigators feel this pressure even when it is not spoken. And pressure creates urgency, not for accuracy, but for resolution. This is when investigations become vulnerable to premature confidence. Confidence feels stabilizing. Confidence reassures others. Confidence reduces scrutiny. But confidence does not equal correctness. When leads stop being leads. By hour 40, many leads have quietly expired. Witnesses stop answering calls. Suspects lawyer up. Digital trails go cold. What remains is no longer fluid. It is fixed. Investigators may still pursue angles, but those angles now exist within tight boundaries. The open field has narrowed to a corridor, and corridors do not allow deviation. The quiet creation of cold cases. Cold cases are often imagined as unsolved crimes that fade with time. In reality, many are created here, not years later, not after budgets are cut, but during these final hours of the first 48, when evidence was almost enough, but not quite, when leads were close, but not preserved, when certainty replaced curiosity. Once this happens, cases do not die dramatically. They slow, then stall, then harden into permanent uncertainty. When momentum replaces questioning. By the end of the second day, investigators often feel they know the case. They may still be wrong, but the feeling itself becomes powerful. Once that feeling sets in, the investigation shifts from asking, "What do we know?" to asking, "How do we prove what we believe?" That shift is the point of no return, because proving belief is very different from discovering truth. The locking of the record. By hour 48, the official record is largely complete. Initial reports are filed. Statements are formalized. Evidence is logged and processed. This record will follow the case forever. It will be cited in court. It will be dissected on appeal. It will be reviewed years later by people who were never present. And any weakness introduced during these first 2 days will be magnified under that scrutiny. Why cases rarely recover after this point. From this point forward, investigations do not gain strength. They only gain clarity or reveal weakness. New technology may refine evidence. New witnesses may appear. New confessions may surface. But none of those things can replace what time erased early. This is why investigators say the most important work in a murder case happens before anyone realizes it matters. Before arrests. Before headlines. Before trials. Standing at the edge of finality. The end of the first 48 hours is not dramatic. There is no signal, no announcement, no visible shift, just a quiet realization. The case is now what it is. From here on, every step forward is constrained by what survived the clock. Because in murder investigations, time is not just a factor. It is the final authority. And once it rules against you, no amount of effort can overturn its decision. By the time the first 48 hours come to an end, most people believe the hardest part of a murder investigation is still ahead. The truth is far more unsettling. By this point, the most important decisions have already been made, quietly, under pressure, and often without anyone realizing how permanent they were. The crime scene is gone. Witness memories have shifted. Evidence has either been preserved or erased by time itself. What follows, the interrogations, the trials, the verdicts, the headlines, is built entirely on what survived those first 2 days. When cases fall apart years later, they rarely fail because investigators stopped working. They fail because time had already taken what could never be recovered. The public sees justice as something dramatic, a confession, a breakthrough, a final verdict. But in reality, justice is fragile. It depends on discipline when emotions are high, patience when pressure demands speed, and restraint when certainty feels close but hasn't been proven. In America, most murder cases are not won by technology or last-minute discoveries. They are decided in silence, during a window that closes faster than anyone expects. Because once the first 48 hours are gone, there are no resets, no second chances, and no way to undo what time has already changed. Only consequences. Thanks for watching. Like, share, and subscribe.